All right, I think we are going to get started. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a great panel coming up and I'm really excited about it. And it's a very important, critical topic. I will say that I did not come up with the name, but I hope that you enjoyed it and made you chuckle a little bit and want to join us. My name is David Zhu. I'm Chief of Staff at Jobs for the Future. We are a national nonprofit in the education and workforce space. Before we formally dive in, I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about why we're here, talking about this thing called innovative finance. I think I probably don't need to tell this audience, certainly the folks at GSV have been talking about it all week, about the changing nature of education. You know, our traditional approach to education, where you first got educated and then you worked for the rest of your life, that's no longer the reality, if it ever really was. We're now going to be working and learning throughout our lifetimes. We're going to need to figure out how to educate people in very different ways, but also figure out how to pay for that education and training. I used to work at the U.S. Department of Education. Our Pell Grants, I can tell you, are not up to the task. Certainly our Department of Labor funding streams are not sufficient or flexible enough to meet the needs. So we're going to need to find some new approaches to finance education and training. There's certainly an urgency to finding some solutions here. I would say first, the current system wasn't working for everyone anyway. We saw huge equity gaps in post-secondary outcomes. And this was only brought into starker relief this summer after the murder of George Floyd and the broader national reckoning with race that it prompted. And given all the acceleration and change since COVID, we're going to need to figure these things out sooner rather than later. So we at JFF feel a tremendous amount of urgency to build a better and more equitable system. Luckily, I'll say there are a number of more innovative ideas that have emerged over the last few years. Income share agreements certainly get a lot of attention, but there are also portable training benefits, lifelong learning accounts, employer training, pay for success models. And so to try to understand and accelerate some of these innovations, we at JFF started something called Financing the Future. And it's really a place to have that conversation and hopefully drive some action in some of these innovations. And so we're going to touch on those today. And to do that, I have a fabulous group of panelists here. And so I will ask them to each introduce themselves. And before we get into like a longer conversation, just do a quick like lightning round down the horn. So if they'll each just say, you know, the name and one sentence only about your organization. And what is one misconception that you observe in the innovative financing space? And Brooke, perhaps we can start with you.
Yeah, thanks, David. So my name is Brooke Valle. I'm the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer for the San Diego Workforce Partnership. And we are both the Workforce Board for San Diego and a 501c3 focusing on economic mobility for our region. And so one of the misconceptions that we start to see with ISAs is that leveraging ISAs will replace your other funding streams.
Hi, everyone. I'm HK Howard. I'm a director at Third Sector Capital Partners based out of our Boston office. And Third Sector is a nonprofit advisory firm that partners with state and local governments to help them connect their public resources to results or long-term outcomes in people's lives. And often we use pay-for-success models or outcomes-based contracts as a way to solidify those relationships and drive that funding towards outcomes. And I think that one of the biggest misconceptions about innovative finance and pay-for-success in particular is that it's all about the financial incentives, when really there is a lot of other benefits and value in the process of building towards those contracts.
At JFF. Oh. Hi, there we go. Sorry, I'm Lexi Barrett. I work with David at JFF, where I lead JFF policy work. And building off of my role interacting with policymakers, one of the biggest misconceptions I see is that the biggest financing challenge that we have is solving for an 18-year-old leaving home for the first time to go to a four-year university.
Excellent. Yes. So misconceptions abound out there. And so there's lots of things that we need to do to inform folks out in the world about these things. I wonder if we could just start by talking a little bit about some of what I was touching on in the opening, but why are we seeing this increase in interest about innovative finance? Because it really does seem to be a topic of conversation and something that a lot of people are wrestling with. And what are some of the factors do you all think that are behind that?
I can start. I think for us, quite simply, it comes down to the fact that the need is great, particularly when we consider equity and access, and the funding has traditionally been quite limited and difficult for folks to be able to leverage. And I think this sits alongside of, particularly in a workforce and education space, the desire to really have both public and private entities around the table to create lasting partnerships that can truly be transformative. So not just a one-time solution, but things that can be used over time, that can become self-perpetuating, that can serve a really broad and diverse population, right, to be responsive to the needs. Something that was very much on our minds far before the COVID crisis and the racial equity conversations. But I would say what has happened recently has just exacerbated that in a lot of ways. We saw in 3 months, 3 times the number of people laid off that we normally serve in a year. And so the conversations around how do we ensure people have access to what they need from a skilling perspective and the supportive services is even more urgent in terms of scale now than ever before.
I totally agree with that sentiment, Brooke, that part of the motivating factor is obviously those outcomes inequities and generally not achieving the outcomes that we'd like to see, as well as wanting to drive those public and private partnerships. I think to build off of that, I think what we've seen in partnership with some of the state departments of higher ed that we've been working with on Pay for Success projects is that there's a need for partnerships with nonprofit college access and success providers that have a history and an evidence of driving those outcomes, and that currently, as public higher education funding, especially coming from the state, has gone down while the cost of education has gone up, there's not a lot of wiggle room to finance those partnerships. So a need for some additional capital and innovative capital in order to drive and really test out those relationships in pursuit of those positive long-term and more equitable outcomes.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Brooke and HK said. And I think if we look at the big picture of the changing economy, even before the current crisis that we're in, and the changing relationship really between workers and their employers and the career path that they're on, we're seeing just an incredible increase in need and demand for skills development and for education and for training as individuals advance through their career. So that while perhaps it used to be that you would kind of go from education to work, and that was a linear pathway, now we're seeing the need to go back and forth and between those two really throughout someone's career span. And as is often the case with policy, it's far behind the times, right? So the current ways that we have to fund skill development are stuck in a different era of when it was much more linear, not to mention, as HK noted, just the lack of increase in resources especially for public universities and community colleges, as well as training providers and workforce-focused programs as well, have really created, I think, a lot of demand and a lot of pressure on the current systems we have.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's violent agreement here that that there's a lot of need here. And it does seem to me, I've observed in some of these conversations about innovative finance, that you often have them happening in silos. So you have, the policy people talking to themselves, the finance people talking to themselves, and the conversations often don't come together. Have you started seeing more of that, or is there any reason to think that we're going to be actually moving from just everyone sort of talking about it and hand-wringing to actually driving even more solutions forward?
Well, I can say I think that that's what JFS is hoping to do very much. With our Financing the Future initiative, we're specifically trying to tackle practice and policy and research and support for institutions all under the same banner, because we do believe that you have to drive that conversation together. I think that there's a degree to which it's happening more. I definitely have seen HK and Brooke and others from the field kind of getting into policy conversations more, which helps. But from my perspective, I think there are still some really big gaps in terms of a really good understanding of even everything that is going on and what some of these different potential models really look like versus the conception of what they might be.
And I think there's this really interesting opportunity, particularly as we think about what is essentially a newer financial product with income share agreements. Although, different organizations have experimented with it over some time, we don't really have that federal regulatory framework and clear policy, right? For there to be those kind of dialogues between the organizations on the ground that are implementing it, particularly organizations which are like ours that are pseudo-governmental, nonprofit, that are really trying to build programs that have students at the center and protections of those students at the heart, to build it in this collaborative way where policy and principles and practice kind of come together to produce a framework that can support the intended outcome and impact of equity and access for all. And I think I love the work that JFF has dug into with this, and Aspen and others who are really saying, like, let's harness the unique opportunity we have to build it in a way that makes sense.
And I think those proof points are just so important to lift up, and just want to commend you, Brooke, for time and again being San Diego Workforce Partnership being one of those proof points, and testing and building in that way.
Yeah, well, and that's a perfect segue. I was going to ask you, Brooke, if you could tell us a little bit about what you're doing in San Diego and the ISAs that you have, especially in the workforce space. I think people might be more familiar with ISAs in the more traditional education space.
Yeah, so people might in fact say, what in the world is a workforce board doing in the sort of innovative financing space? It's not kind of a traditional space for us. And to the point earlier, we really see income share agreements not as a replacement for our other funding streams. I hope to never be in a position where we are not receiving and boards aren't receiving workforce innovation opportunity or related funds. And I would love if we had access to Pell and other resources, but something that comes alongside of the other funding sources that we have to augment and round out, because it has traditionally been, and it's unlikely to be the case in the future, where we have enough federal, state, city funding to pay for all of the access to education that's needed for workers, let alone the constant need for upskilling if we think about incumbent workers and their ability to advance. And so I think there are lots of different applications that can be considered for ISAs. And we really got to this because of a shortfall in our funding. And we also need to construct a program that was fundamentally able to put together a responsive set of technical skills for individuals based on what we heard in the market, what we heard in employer, a light of the support that folks needed. And that moved outside of a case manager that was needed to make sure they were checking all the appropriate boxes, and into a consultative mentality where we're trying to come alongside with the person to ensure that the needs that they have as they're going through the program are met. And to begin to think very differently and say, okay, yes, there's a repayment. If your life is fundamentally changed through the program, you're paying it back so others in your community can have the opportunity. And I think there was this sense of empowerment as we engaged with students, with the idea that they could come through a program and be in a place where they were doing, they got onto a trajectory, began to work, and then their repayments was supporting somebody else in the San Diego community, right? That was very empowering. It also enables us to say, we'll come along and support you as long as you're repaying your ISA, which is a very different. So fundamentally, we started with 4 programs. We're beginning to expand. It's a pilot. The first one was launched last summer. And the idea is that you can pick in-demand skills in the market that are based on the data and the response from the employers. You can craft a program that takes high-quality education and pairs that with wraparound services. And then you set an income threshold that's responsive to your local area. So for us, it's $40,000. And that takes into consideration that $17.65 is our hourly living wage for San Diego. And then use that to enable individuals' success, right? Working closely with a high quality training provider and the other supports that they need. And so we're still at the beginning in a lot of ways. We had our first class graduate in the spring and just enter repayment in July. But I think it gives us a really innovative way to address not only a funding gap, but to begin to encourage private sector to consider how they can play a role in this, as well as even to start to engage in conversations with employers about how an income share agreement model might be a way to attract and retain talent, right, as a new mechanism to pay for the education that folks need in upskilling.
That's great. I love that, the idea of your repayment supporting someone else in the community and really having those linkages across the community. I think that's a really clever way to talk about that. I wonder, HK, if we could turn to you for a minute and talk about some of your work with higher education systems and what third sector is aiming to do to shift the conversation.
Sure, happy to. So I guess we're starting with the thesis that this panel started with around, in higher ed, not achieving the outcomes that we'd like to see. So, nationally, only about 60% of students graduate from a four-year institution in 6 years. And for low-income students, students of color, first-generation students, those outcomes are much lower. I think the good news is that there are college access and success providers out there that have a really strong evidence base of moving the needle for these students. And many of those providers have been featured in this conference so far. The challenge is that many of those providers do not have direct public funding relationships with state systems of higher ed or with individual institutions, despite the fact that those improved outcomes for students can lead in some cases to real financial benefits for those institutions as well. So we're really working with state systems of higher ed to think about what it would take to forge those public funding relationships between higher ed and college access and success providers, really focused on outcomes and also in a way that targets specific underserved student populations and student populations who might already be receiving additional scholarship dollars, but still aren't achieving, the outcomes that we'd hope to see. So we started last year with a national cohort with 4 states to test the feasibility of Pay for Success in this way. And now this year, with some funding from Kresge Foundation and ECMC Foundation, are working really deeply with the Colorado Department of Higher Ed and the Ohio Department of Higher Ed to build towards Pay for Success projects that we will hopefully launch in 2021 and deliver college access and success supports to different student groups in those 2 states.
Yeah, no, those are super exciting to follow. And I think we'll have a little bit of time after to come back to questions, and the audience might have some questions, so we might be able to return to that. I wonder if Lexi could, before we do that, give us just a little bit of an overview of some of the other things that are out there. There's a whole array of new financing mechanisms that I know you've been digging into a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both the Pay for Success models and the IFA models are really great examples, but there are a lot of other ideas out there too, and things that are kind of brewing. So one that I wanted to talk about was portable training accounts, or you might call them lifelong learning accounts, or you might call them individual training accounts, or you might call them opportunity accounts. I think maybe because there are a lot of bills in Congress right now about them, they have lots of different names. But at the center of it is the idea of, can we give individuals a pot of money that they own that is dedicated towards being able to be spent on education and training as they need it throughout their lives. And there are concepts of this that exist around the world and in the country and already in in public funding right now, but we've seen a real uptick in interest amongst policymakers in pursuing this, and a lot of different flavors of it that might be more public funded, might be more individual funded, might be more employer funded. But I think it's a really interesting idea because it's very focused on really the choice of the learner or the worker in finding the training and the education that they need. And it's less bound to some of the constraints around what that program needs to look like or where it has to happen or kind of more traditional forms of education. So I think that is something to keep an eye on for sure. And then the other one I wanted to talk about was training that happens with employers, right? So employers are developing the skills of their employees all the time in formal and informal ways. And I think one of the things that we're looking at going forward is how do we incentivize the employer role in training and in education of their employees? And especially how do we direct it towards entry-level employees, lower paid employees, because those are some of the places where when you look at some of the information about where employers are investing, that they haven't traditionally invested as much. A lot of the education and training investments that employers are making tend to go to actually their more experienced employees, their higher skilled employees, and sometimes can even be more as a retention strategy rather than really a pathway strategy for an employee. And that's another place that there is something we're watching from a policy perspective, because there are currently some tax incentives that could be expanded, could be shifted. And I think you also look at take apprenticeships, right? Like that's a great example of a role for employers with education providers that is not leaving those that participate with debt. So I think there are probably even more innovative ways than people are thinking right now about how to bring providers and employers and workers together in figuring out what that right balance is, so that the burden of the cost is not being borne entirely by the worker or the learner, which is, I think, what all of us are trying to avoid.
Great. Yeah, and I want to invite the audience to submit any questions, and even the panelists to ask each other things. I guess one thing that comes to mind as you're all talking is that so much of this comes to quality and outcomes. And if you want to finance things in a different way, you have to actually make sure that it works. And we don't really have good mechanisms for measuring quality. So it sort of gets us back to that conversation. I wonder if there are things that you all are seeing out there that give you some hope that we actually are evolving. And I know that some of you are building the evidence to do that. But just, are there things that we're seeing in the quality and outcome space that should leave us hopeful?
I think a couple of things for me have really emerged in this work, and I was thinking about it even as Lexi was sharing too. It kind of cuts across is, I think it's all of these approaches encourage a real focus on a quality job at the end of the pathway, right? And so oftentimes there can be training programs that are very well intended, but if care isn't taken about ensuring that they're connected to a quality job at the end of the pathway, then it's debatable whether that person's life has truly been improved. And we think about job quality, not just from the perspective of wage, although that's incredibly important, but other considerations. Obviously, top of mind right now is health and safety, but access to benefits, childcare, critically important. So I think that there's really been a level of conversation around this as you begin to think about the way you incentivize the payment and who the payer is. That changes the dynamic a lot. And one of the things that we love about pay for performance, ISAs, and these models that Lexi is also sharing about with the portable accounts, is that you're really focusing, even though these all have different names, of getting to a place where you're paying on specific outcomes that are directly tied, aligning the objectives of the learner, the participant, with the service delivery, right? And so in an ISA model that we pay the training provider is fundamentally different. It's payments through a service agreement that are linked to certain outcomes, including successful completion of the coursework, right? Pay for performance has similar constructs. And so a lot of times the traditional systems aren't set up that way. The payment might be occurring first. Even in a 4-year environment, it's sort of you pay up front to enroll, and then we're hopeful that there's a positive outcome at the end, but it's not linked in the same way. And I think those shifts are really healthy. It starts to allow the consumer, both in terms of the agencies like mine that are involved in selecting the programs, and the participant, right, to make really informed decisions about whether that training program is going to help them achieve what they want. And it also enables us to think really critically about the quality of the credential that folks are receiving at the end, and engaging with employers about whether that is something that is recognized and that is meaningful and that is going to be connected to a job. And so I feel like changing the payment structure drives what you measure, which matters at the end of the day, and how you engage, right?
Yeah, I think building off of that, Brooke, in terms of how you engage, I think another element of it is, who that data is shared with, how frequently, how it's interpreted in context together and discussed in real time in order to make those shifts and continuous improvement, if you will. And I think that's another benefit of that real focus that tying dollars to outcomes drives on those results, and needing to work backwards from those results in partnership with the partners around the table to make sure that you're on track to achieving those outcomes. And if not, what real-time changes can you make in the process?
All right. I was going to ask a question about actually trying to get some of these things done. So ways that we're either going to get these things done, like how's it going to happen, and what are some of the barriers that we're seeing that we could maybe identify and try to advocate for removing?
Yeah, I will say, so in the workforce space, and we've been engaging with other workforce boards, both when we in the past had the pleasure to work on a pay for performance contract, and now that we've been working on ISA efforts, I'll say a couple of the barriers that we see. One is for ISAs, the lack of the regulatory framework is something that gives some states and agencies a little bit of discomfort, right? The unknown. And in one hand, it allows practice to help drive and inform the eventual policy. But on the other hand, it can be difficult for states or locals to be comfortable moving out into a space that's left less defined. And I would say the other thing that comes out when you're thinking about bringing new forms of capital to the table, and how you kind of structure those private-public partnerships, how the impacts of COVID and the impacts of the conversations about racial justice, which certainly it's not a new conversation, it's just come to light in a different way right now, like how the solutions are able to adjust, adapt, further addressing those issues in a real way, and working with funders around how innovative financing, which can in this case enable good jobs, is an equity play, right? It is addressing equity issues. It's not outside from. So beginning to align how these kind of approaches can address equity considerations, can address rebuilding equitably, rebounding from COVID. I think working through how you bring the pieces together is something that can be challenging for communities, because agencies like mine are also grappling with very high unemployment rates and the real-time needs of making sure that basic needs are met for their population.
Can we actually pause on that point for a second? Because I think it's so important that, and I tried to allude to this at the beginning as well, that finding new ways to finance education and training really can be an equity play. It can give people more options in a place where they can't. I often find that the ISA conversation is framed as it's just trying to give these for-profit providers access to students and to get more money out of them. And so I just wonder if we could each unpack a little bit about some of these equity implications. And yes, there are risks, but yes, it can also drive more equity.
Yeah, I can start. I think for us, first off, I mean, as a workforce board, we're really charged with serving populations that are often sort of passed by systems. And our ISA program, it's in the 70% of folks that are minorities. that are participating. For us, when we look at access to financing, what we have in our system currently is the ability for folks to tap into workforce funding, the ability for them to use family or personal dollars or private loans. And what we see in many cases with the folks that we serve is if they're walking through our doors, they likely don't have the ability to tap into family or personal dollars, and they might not qualify for loans. And so we've structured the ISA around, we're not using credit scores. We're not using any of those traditional considerations. We're focused on, do you have the capabilities to be successful in the program that you want to pursue? We want to set you up for success, which can encourage, despite background and pedigree that might be used for some programs as a determination, and the credit score, which is used often for a proxy for risk, to set that aside and say, we're really looking at capabilities. And we're kind of turning this on its head in terms of how we think about making sure that everyone has an opportunity to consider pursuing education. And we really use the idea of the competency, there's testing to make sure people are equipped, coupled with need is a big determiner for us of making sure we make ISAs available, and then grit, right? Their engagement with us. We want to make sure that this is truly the right opportunity for them. And so I think turning on its head the way we think about what risk and financial products, right, shifts the equity lens, right, and enables you to wedge open the doors and say, this is about competency, and competency has nothing to do with your credit score or your skin color or any of those other factors.
Building off of that, I think at Third Sector, we feel very strongly that if you're going to use outcomes-based models or pay-for-success models to drive resources towards results, it should be for those who are furthest from those results and furthest from opportunity. So often the place that we start, and where we started with this cohort of state systems of higher ed, was looking at the data and disaggregating it and understanding who is experiencing, those disproportionately poor outcomes, and really focusing in on them and building from there. And I think that's a great way to kind of drive innovative finance towards advancing equity.
Well, and I know, HK, your organization and ours have done a lot of work of starting with listening directly to the people that the products intend to serve, right? Like going to the community to engage them around what they need and what's going to serve them in their trajectory.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's that combination of data and community voice, student voice, worker voice that is really powerful for informing the rest of the project.
Yeah, I really see a lot of potential in having multiple different ways to finance education and skills development as having the potential to be really empowering to individuals. Because we're not trying to say that there's a single solution that's going to work for everyone, right? Like ISAs are not a silver bullet. They're not going to be the right solution for everybody, but they might be the right solution for some people. And so how do we make sure that that those options are available, that they are crafted in such a way that they are focused on the students, on the learner, on the worker, that we have the regulatory environment and the student and consumer protections in place that need to be there to make sure that they're not going to get taken advantage of. But I think it does give you the opportunity to really work with individuals to chart their path, both in terms of what is their direction and where are they trying to get to, but then also how do they want to finance it? And right now, there just, for so many individuals, especially in the workforce space, there just aren't a lot of options. And I think it can be easy for people to forget that even though some of these programs on their face might not be very expensive, for a lot of people, even that small expense is too much. Like they don't have that money on hand. And so how do you construct something that takes someone's real situation in mind and gets them the best chance of success?
And I love, Lexi, what you were talking about. It's like everything we can do with these products to ensure we're giving space for worker voice, right? And that it's empowering. I so agree with Lexi. It's like, this is really about giving customers choice. about them being able to make the decision that is right for them in their situation, that they have options that they can select from in order to advance instead of feeling like they're just coming up against a wall and that they're stuck. And I mean, we looked at our customer satisfaction surveys, and the 15% of people that said they were unhappy were primarily unhappy because we didn't have money. I mean, that was to give them for training. That was people just feeling stuck, that they didn't have options to choose from. And so I love how this can build pathways not only to hear from people directly, but to remove that feeling of being trapped and unable to move forward because they don't have options to pick from.
I wish we had thought to, or that we had the opportunity to include like a student on this panel, and maybe in future ones we can. But I wonder if, Brooke or HK, there are students that are in some of your programs that you could tell a story of, or that you have some experience about that you might that might be illuminating for folks.
Go ahead, Brooke, since you have a program that's up and running.
Yeah, so we've had a number of students now that have graduated in business intelligence and digital marketing. And the stories that really touch me are stories where, and we've had several of these folks who are in essentially sort of a frontline retail job. They had a dream and a passion around, we've had this both in digital marketing and in the development side. They believed that they had these skills, but they weren't able to break through the barrier of getting a job in the new space. They didn't have the credential to get into the space. And in some cases, without WIOA funding or a program like this, they would have just continued in the job that we have. We have somebody who was in working for a local theater company. We had a mom with multiple kids who wouldn't have been able to afford to go back to school, but needed to get back into the market. And so the ISA enabled them to not have to sort of make the choice to stay in the career path where they were earning some money, but it wasn't sufficient, and to be able to take the passions that they had and begin to prove them out, right, through this pathway. One of our students, Claire, who's a mom, multiple kids, she and her son were both studying at the same time. She'd been out of the market for quite a number of years and wouldn't have been able to afford to go back without a program like this. And it's just, for her, it was transformative to say, you know, I've been out, I'm now in my 40s, I need to upskill, I have a passion around digital marketing, and this gives me an opportunity to do so. I don't have to choose between my son or my education. And so just the stories like that are the things that really hit home for us, and the reason to continue to do this work.
Great. I am not, Lexi, going to ask you to give me your crystal ball of what's going to happen in DC and Congress and all that. But is there anything about the policy environment that you see changing, or that you see that there might be movement on in the say medium term?
Yeah, so I think you can think about the issues that the federal government needs to wrestle with to help this movement along in a couple different ways. I think that there is a part of it that is just about complexity, right? So when we talk about something like ISAs, and just it's a totally new kind of financial product that needs a regulatory environment that makes sense for it, that is something that Congress needs to act on. This issue that you addressed earlier, David, around quality and outcomes, right? We're talking about outcomes, but the government is much more comfortable dealing with inputs, right, than outcomes and measuring them. And I think that is something that there has been a lot of interest in, and certainly from the traditional higher education sector, and looking at what we're seeing in terms of increasing costs and not necessarily better results, that there's been a lot of conversation about. And then I think that we also have to deal with the resource constraints issue. So I think that there's obviously, the talk about college promise, the talk about new funding streams, that is going to continue. And I think certainly we are always trying to bring funding for the workforce development system into that conversation as well, because it's often left out. But we need to say, if you're thinking about something like portable training accounts, that is something that I think in most models the government would be putting some kind of a stake into that and hopefully pulling other stakes in as well. But that does take a commitment and a desire to really make investments and make proactive choices from public policy to remove either some of these barriers in terms of the complexity and the lack of data and information that providers need, but also kind of give some incentives to help these programs develop and to give them some kind of running room while keeping front and center consumer protections and students and workers as kind of the main point of focus. So I don't know what's going to happen at all. I don't think any of us can pretend that in October of 2020. But I do feel like there's a sense to which these have been building conversations, and we haven't gotten there in terms of response to COVID yet. Like we always say, like we're still dealing in the relief phase of it. We haven't gotten to recovery. But that is going to happen at the state level and at the federal level. This is not an economic recession that's going to turn around overnight. And we're going to have to deal with all these individuals who have lost their jobs and have lost their careers, maybe even. And so I do think it's something that policymakers will be turning to at some point. So it's so exciting to have these real life examples that we can bring to them as they're deciding what to do.
Excellent. Well, I know we need to end here at 45 past the hour, and I have one very quick question to ask everyone, but I did want to just open the floor briefly to see if anyone had any last thoughts to share, or if there are things that your fellow panelists had brought up that you wanted to note.
Just to name, I guess, that I'm hearing a real kind of tension of being asked to do more with less, but also needing flexibility, customization, time to listen to workers. And that's a tough combination. And yet, despite that, we are seeing, states and local examples of being really committed to investing in that innovation.
Yeah, and I would say for me, it's that innovative financing, right, isn't unto itself the end all be all, but it's an important tool in creating equitable pathways for individuals and amplifying worker voice when it's centered around the needs of the individuals.
Yeah, that is, I think, one of my takeaways and main interest points too, is that how can innovative finance be really a tool to refocus the point of all of this on the people that we're trying to serve, which I think can often elude us or get lost in the conversation.
Excellent. Very good. Well, on our way out, I was going to just ask give the magic wand to each of the panelists to say, if you could write the headline in 5 years or 10 years or however far out you want to go of something that has happened in the innovative finance space, what would your headline be? What do you want to see happen in the world?
I would love to see that the financing gap for worker skilling had been closed as a result of public-private partnership.
I want to borrow a mantra from one of our partners in Massachusetts, the former commissioner of the Department of Transitional Assistance, Jeff McHugh. He says, "We don't buy services, we buy outcomes." And I would love for that to be the headline.
For that to be true, yeah. That's great.
So I love reading, when I would open the newspaper, like a really good personal interest story. Like that's something I love. And I would love in 5 years, 10 years, to read the story of someone who lost their job during the COVID crisis, was able to find a path to a successful new career and had financing provided to them so that they were able to emerge on the other side of that without debt and feeling empowered, as we've talked about today.
Wonderful. Well, our time is just out, but I wanted to thank the panelists for participating today. And I mean, I think this conversation was so great, and it really was so grounded in equity and the individuals and the new society that we're trying to build here. And I just hope that more conversations about innovative finance could have this sort of bent to them. And so we'll be working through our JFF Financing the Future project to try to increase the likelihood that these kinds of conversations really do focus on the individual. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.